left is kind of like to the left in this picture. Okay, so let's do that and see what happens. And perfect, there's the answer. Perry's using 14, 16 kilobytes, Alice is using 52, and Bob's using 56. Okay, so there's the epitome of shell scripting. We get to use some program and say I want it to run this every day because those three people are running these scientific simulations that are eating up a lot of space, and I want to make sure they haven't gotten out of control. I can just run this script every day, and I don't have to run these individual commands to do it. I just set the script up, and then I go out there and I just run it by saying demo 4 Perry, Alice, Bob. And what's more is it's completely flexible, right? I can do the same thing as I did up above, but I could take Bob off the list and it still works nice and the output is still clean, okay? Or I could do the same thing and I could put Bob and Candy on the list, okay? So again, I've got all the output and it's nice and clean output, so it's a completely flexible script. It just loops for every input that I give it, and it does that command, that little set of commands for each of these users that I list. Our last topic for this nugget is going to be a little discussion of Lilo, the Linux loader. To understand what Lilo does, let's talk a little bit about what happens when you turn on your computer. When you power up your computer, the first thing that happens is the BIOS starts, the basic input-output system. And what that does is it goes around and it probes some hardware. It checks to make sure your memory timing is correct and your devices are plugged in, stuff like that. And when all those tests pass, then what the BIOS does is it goes to the master boot record on your disk. Now, the BIOS knows where the master boot record is, like you know where the light switch is when you walk in your dark living room or something. Okay? It just knows where it is, it goes there, and it looks for a bootloader in the master boot record. Now, one of the bootloaders that could be there is Lilo. Okay? And we can look at the configuration file for Lilo. It's in the etc directory. On most systems, it's called lilo.conf. On my computer, it's called lilo.conf.anaconda on this Red Hat system. So we'll go in there, and the top part here is just like some basic Lilo configuration options, and then the bottom part here would be one entry for each operating system. Now, I only have one operating system here, so that's why there's only one entry. But if I had Linux and Windows or multiple versions of Linux or whatever, they would all be listed here in a separate little paragraph. And the options up here, what these say is the prompt option says that Lilo should prompt me when it starts up and give me a choice of which operating system I want to start. The timeout says if I wait too long, then it's just going to go ahead and boot the default, which is Linux, and that's what this label is down here, also Linux. That's what ties these together. Now the timeout here, this is 50 decaseconds, which is 5 seconds. I don't know why they use decaseconds instead of just plain old seconds, but they did, so we'll live with it. It's no big deal. The boot option here, this says that it should boot off the first SCSI disk. SDA is the first SCSI disk. Okay, so that's what these options are. We can set these options with the Lilo command. And if we do a man on Lilo, you'll see all the different options there. There's the -D option to set that delay or that timeout. And you can set all the other things through here as well. Now, you might not have Lilo as your default on your system. Maybe you have Grub, which is the Grand Unified Bootloader. They basically work the same way. Grub's something a little bit newer. Maybe it's going to be a little bit more advanced and accept it. Right now, I think Lilo is probably more common. Whatever, it doesn't matter. They both kind of do the same job, and configuring them is basically the same task. But it's good to be able to have multiple operating systems. Sometimes people want to have multiple versions of Linux. Maybe one is a more experimental version. They want to try that out before they commit to it, and they keep their old version, which is more stable, and they can use that. So Lilo and Grub have many options and many advantages for people that want to experiment or have different operating systems on their computer. All right, well, it's time to wrap up another nugget. This is the nugget that I call Linux Essentials. First, we touched on X Windows. We talked about the X Server, X386. We talked about the various window managers and desktop environments that were out there that you could use. We also learned how to configure those through the graphical configuration tools that are available in Linux. We also talked about a Red Hat tool called Xconfigurator. Now, that was more of a low-level tool. Like if you bought a new video card, you would use Xconfigurator to configure your system for that. And then we touched on shell scripts. And this really was a tip of the iceberg discussion. I mean, I tried to give you a little bit of depth and show you how useful a shell script could be, but there's a million times more out there. There's 500-page books written about shell scripts. So there's no way that you should expect after a 10-minute introduction, if that really was your introduction to shell scripting, that you should be able to go out and write any kind of shell script that you want. But hopefully I whetted your appetite enough that you'll go out there and learn some more about it. I mean, it's to the point where I still learn about shell scripts, and I wrote my first shell script back in the 80s. And then we talked about Lilo, the Linux loader. We talked about the configuration file for Lilo, how you can manipulate that, how you can set that up so it can boot multiple operating systems. Well, I hope you found this nugget informative, and thanks again for viewing.